Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I moved from just outside Philadelphia to Georgia in the middle of summer, and I don't think I've ever felt so out of place in my life. Back home, the air was dense, sure, but it was different. Industrial and heavy with the smell of the city. Down here it was thick and wet, like breathing through a soaked towel. I had moved because I needed work. And a friend of a friend had mentioned this catering company that always needed extra hands. I didn't have much going for me at the time, so I took the offer without thinking much about it. The catering company was based in a mid-sized town about an hour outside of Atlanta, but they handled events all over Georgia. Weddings, church functions, retirement homes, whatever people paid for. The main building was a big old warehouse that had been converted into a kitchen. It always smelled like boiled shrimp, bleach, and fryer oil. The guy who trained me, Rob, was from Philadelphia too, which helped me feel a little less like a complete stranger. He'd been there a few years already, and said he knew what it was like to be an outsider in these parts. He laughed when I told him I didn't understand half the things people said around me. He said, "You'll get used to it." But he had this look on his face that told me he didn't believe that. My first week there, we had a job scheduled in a small town about 2 hours south. Rob said it was for a private book club. That's how they had described it when they called in the order. We loaded up the van early that morning with trays of chicken salad sandwiches, fruit platters, lemonade pitchers, and old-fashioned desserts like chess pie and lemon bars. It was the kind of stuff you'd see in a 1950s church potluck. I didn't ask many questions. I was new, and I didn't want to make a bad impression. It was a long drive through empty roads that seemed to cut through nothing but pine trees and overgrown fields. Every few miles we'd pass a house that looked abandoned, but still had a light burning inside. The further we went, the smaller the towns got, until even the gas stations started to look like something out of a different decade. Faded Coca-Cola signs, broken pumps, porches with rocking chairs out front. By the time we reached the town where the event was, I was already sweating through my shirt. Rob turned down a dirt road that didn't even have a sign, and I remember thinking this couldn't possibly be the right way. The road went on for a long time, winding between trees and past patches of open land, until we finally reached an old white mansion sitting at the end of the road. It looked like it had been standing there since before the Civil War. Huge columns, wraparound porch, chipped paint, and ivy crawling up the sides. There were about a dozen cars parked out front, all old models but well kept, like they belonged to people who had money but didn't care much for showing it. The air was still and hot, the kind of heat that made the insects sound louder. When we got out, I saw 2 older black men working near a small garden on the side of the property. They wore plain white shirts and suspenders, and they both had their heads down, moving slow under the sun. Behind them was a small shack, if you could call it that. It was a one-room building with tin roofing, and no windows that I could see. One of them lifted his head when our van pulled up. But the moment he saw the women on the porch watching, he went right back to his work. The women were all sitting on the porch, dressed in pastel-colored dresses that looked like something from another century. Every single one of them had white or silver hair, styled perfectly. They all looked to be around 90 years old or more, their skin thin and spotted. But they sat upright with this strange sort of pride, like they were hosting something important. I tried to smile when we brought the food up, but none of them smiled back. They just looked at us quiet, watching. Inside, the house smelled like lemon polish and old paper. Every wall was lined with shelves full of books, but most of them were covered in dust. We set up the food on a long dining table in a room that must have once hosted big dinners. The ceiling was high, and there were portraits on the walls of men in military uniforms and women in stiff dresses, all painted in that old Southern style. Rob didn't talk much while we worked. I followed his lead, laying out trays and filling glasses. The women talked among themselves in low voices, slow and polite, but I couldn't make out most of what they said. Every now and then, one of them would glance at the two men outside through the window. The men didn't come inside. They never even looked up. When it was time to serve, Rob told me to just stand by and refill plates or pour drinks when asked. The women didn't speak to us directly, not once. They'd gesture if they wanted more of something, or one of them would whisper something, and another woman, clearly the one in charge, would repeat it to us. I noticed that the two men outside never came in for food. Later, when I went to throw out some trash, I saw them sitting by their shack, eating off paper plates. They were quiet, barely talking, sitting in the shade like they'd done this routine for years. Something about the whole day made me uneasy. It wasn't just the heat or the strange silence. It was the way everyone seemed stuck in another time. The house, the people, the way they treated those two men, even the language they used, it all felt wrong. Like I had stepped through a door and ended up somewhere that shouldn't still exist. We finally packed up and got ready to leave just as the sun started to set. The light was golden, and the air smelled faintly of honeysuckle, but it didn't make me feel any better. Just wanted to get back to somewhere with streetlights and noise. Once we were on the road, Rob started laughing quietly. I asked what was funny, but he just shook his head for a while. Then he said, "You don't see places like that back home, huh?" I told him I didn't, and I hoped I never would again. He told me that the catering company had done events there for years, and that nothing ever changed. Same women, same setup, same two men working the property. He said nobody knew how old they were or how long they'd been there. But they never left. I tried to laugh it off, but the image stuck in my head. The two men outside, the way they avoided eye contact, the way those women spoke like they still lived in a world where time hadn't moved forward. As we drove back, the roads got darker and narrower. The air felt cooler now that the sun was down, but the woods around us were pitch black. Every few miles, the headlights would catch something: a mailbox, an old sign, a deer darting across the road. But mostly, it was just darkness. Then, as we came around a bend, I saw lights ahead. At first, I thought it was a campfire or something. But as we got closer, I realized it was a group of people standing by a lake. There must have been at least 20 of them, all dressed in white clothes that looked old-fashioned. Long dresses, button-up shirts, suspenders. The light was coming from a few lanterns and candles they had placed around the water's edge. Rob slowed down as we passed. None of them looked at us. They were focused on the water. A woman stood waist-deep in it, and two men on either side of her were holding her arms. One of them said something I couldn't make out, and then they dunked her under the water. When she came back up, they all started speaking at once, their voices rising in some strange chant that didn't sound like any language I knew. It wasn't shouting exactly. It was more like a rhythm. Like they were all saying something together, but not in sync. It echoed across the lake and into the trees. Some of them had their hands in the air, swaying, their clothes glowing pale under the lantern light. I felt something tighten in my chest. Rob didn't say anything at first. He just kept driving slowly past them. When I finally turned to look at him, I saw that he was smiling again, but it wasn't a friendly smile. After a minute, once we were well past the lake, he said, "Told you the South was different." His tone was calm, but there was something in it that made me think he had planned this, like he knew what we'd see and wanted me to see it. We didn't say much the rest of the drive. I just watched the trees blur by and tried to forget the sound of those voices. By the time we got back to the warehouse, it was after midnight. Rob parked the van, turned off the engine, and sat there for a second before looking over at me. He said quietly, "When I first moved down here, I saw the same thing. Same lake, same kind of people. They do it a few times a year. Folks say it's a baptism, but I don't think church has much to do with it." Then he got out of the van like it was nothing, like it was just another shift ending. I stayed sitting there for a while after he left, staring out at the dark parking lot. The air was still, the night completely quiet except for the sound of insects. I couldn't stop picturing that woman being held under the water. The way those people's voices had mixed together in the dark. Over the next few weeks, I worked more jobs around the state, weddings, fundraisers, small-town events, but I never forgot that drive home. Every time we took a back road, I half expected to see that lake again. Those white clothes glowing in the dark. I never did, but I also never asked where we were going anymore. I didn't want to know. Sometimes I'd pass by an old church or a dirt road leading toward the woods, and I'd get that same uneasy feeling in my gut. The one that told me there were still corners of this world where time never moved forward. Where people kept their old ways alive because no one ever came to tell them to stop. And sometimes when I'd see Rob at work, he'd give me that same knowing look, like he still thought it was funny, like he wanted to remind me that he'd been right. This place was different. But to me, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like something that should have stayed hidden. Something I wasn't supposed to see but did, and now couldn't forget. I still remember that drive like it's burned into the back of my mind. It was my first tour, the first time I'd ever been on the road that long for music. I was new, excited, trying to take it all in. The van smelled like coffee, fast food, and sweat. One of those cheap rentals that rattled every time we hit a bump. We left Phoenix early in the morning. The kind of morning where the desert sky looks washed out and empty, a pale blue fading into white at the horizon. The sun had barely cleared the mountains when we got onto the I-10, heading east toward Austin. It was supposed to be about an 18-hour drive if we went straight through. We figured we'd just power through it. Switch off drivers, keep the energy up with caffeine and bad jokes. It sounded easy enough when we planned it. But once we hit the Texas border, things started to feel different. The landscape stretched out forever, miles and miles of nothing but scrubland and open desert, the horizon blurring into the sky. There were stretches where we wouldn't see another car for an hour, not even a distant pair of headlights. The silence out there was heavy, like it had weight. You could almost feel it pressing on your chest. Once we hit El Paso, it was already dark. The highway lights got fewer and fewer until there weren't any at all. Just the van headlights carving two pale beams through the blackness. Every so often, a green reflective sign would flash past, and we'd see the name of some tiny town we'd never heard of. None of them looked like they were anywhere nearby. We were all getting tired by then, and someone suggested we cut through to a smaller highway to make better time. I don't even remember who was driving at that point, but we got off I-10 and onto Highway 230. At first, it felt like a good idea. A shortcut, less traffic. But almost immediately it felt wrong. The road narrowed to a two-lane strip that twisted through low hills and stretches of mesquite. No streetlights, no houses visible from the road. The only thing you could see were the faint outlines of wire fences and old wooden posts passing by in the headlights. Every few miles, we'd spot a road sign so faded you could barely make out the letters. After about an hour of that, we came to a town. I never saw a name sign, but it was there, sitting right in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a ghost town, not exactly, it looked lived in. But it was too still. The main street had stores, gas stations, a diner, even what looked like a small high school. But there wasn't a single car on the road. Not parked, not moving. The air felt strange, thick in a way that made you roll the window up without knowing why. We slowed down, thinking maybe everyone was asleep. It was late after all. But even then, it didn't make sense. Every small town has at least a few people out late. A car passing through, someone closing up shop, a porch light or two. But here, nothing, not a sound. We rolled past a hardware store and there were lights on inside. Not bright ones, just dim yellow light coming from a couple of old ceiling fixtures. Through the windows, I could see shelves with tools and boxes, everything covered in dust like it hadn't been touched in years. Next door was a grocery store, and it was the same thing. Lights on, but no movement. It gave me this strange sense of unease, like we were driving through a photograph of a town rather than a real one. I remember passing a storefront with big windows, maybe an old clothing shop or a general store. In the window, there was a banner that said, Happy Homecoming 2005, written in faded paint. That caught my eye right away, because it was 2008. The letters were still bright enough to read even in the dim light. I stared at that sign as we passed, feeling this weird chill crawl up my spine. It was such a small thing, but something about it was off. Like the town had just stopped moving one day, and no one had bothered to start it again. We kept driving, waiting to see someone, anyone, maybe a car coming from the other direction. But for 15 minutes, there was nothing. Just that same eerie emptiness. Streetlights that buzzed faintly overhead. A few flickering lights in store windows. And no sound but the tires on the asphalt. It got to the point where even the guys in the van who'd been joking all day stopped talking. The silence wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside the van too. When we finally cleared the last of the town, the road opened up again into black desert. No signs of civilization for miles. I remember glancing at the rearview mirror and seeing the glow of the town shrinking behind us until it disappeared completely, swallowed by the night. None of us said much after that. We just drove. The unease lingered, though. It stuck in the back of my head like a splinter. We got to Austin early the next morning. I didn't think much about that town for the next few days. We were busy playing shows, meeting people, living the excitement of it all. The memory faded into that blur of travel and sound checks and late-night fast food runs. But when it came time to head back to Phoenix, I remembered the town. Someone mentioned we'd probably hit that same stretch again, and everyone got quiet for a second. We left Austin early, aiming to get back before sunrise the next day. By the time we reached that same section of highway, it was around noon on a Friday. The sky was clear, bright blue, sun glaring off the road. It felt safer somehow. Daylight always makes things seem more normal. But as soon as we approached that same town, I started feeling that same strange pressure in my chest again. We came around a bend, and there it was. The same town, same road, same buildings. But it was completely different. It was alive. There were cars everywhere, parked along the streets, pulling in and out of lots, even honking at each other. The sidewalks were full of people, dozens, maybe hundreds. Families, kids, older folks. There were booths set up on the sidewalks, food stands, banners hanging between streetlights. It looked like some kind of carnival or street fair. Music playing faintly through speakers, people laughing. The whole place was bright and noisy and full of life. But that was the thing. It didn't look like a normal town busy with daily life. It looked too full, too crowded, like the entire population had poured into the streets all at once. I didn't recognize any faces, but I remember seeing how everyone was dressed. A lot of them wore clothes that looked a little dated. Old-style denim jackets, pastel shirts, hairstyles that didn't quite fit the year we were in. It wasn't anything too dramatic, just subtly wrong. As we drove through, I felt that unease again, only stronger this time. I couldn't explain it. The town looked normal, but my stomach twisted like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to. The others noticed it too, I could tell. No one said anything, but everyone was watching out the windows with the same tense expression. The music from the fair got louder as we went through the center of town, but it sounded distorted through the glass, like a recording playing just slightly too slow. We passed that same storefront from before, the one with the homecoming sign. It was still there. The same banner, same letters, Happy Homecoming 2005, but the paint looked fresh now, the window cleaner. Inside, I could see people moving around, chatting, shopping. There were decorations up, streamers hanging from the ceiling. It was the same store, but it looked like it was frozen between two times. By the time we reached the other end of town, no one was speaking. The second we hit open road again, the air in the van felt lighter, like we'd stepped out of something we weren't meant to be in. No one brought it up for the rest of the drive. It was one of those things you don't want to talk about right away, because you're not sure you even saw it the way you remember. But it stuck with me. I couldn't shake the image of that empty town at night, and that same place crowded and alive in daylight. Like the two versions were existing separately, switching places when no one was looking. 2 weeks later, We were driving through Florida on the way to Orlando. It was another long haul, and by the time we hit Casadaga, it was around 2 in the morning. I'd heard of the place before, mostly from random conversations. People called it a spiritualist town, said it was full of mediums and psychic healers. I didn't believe in any of that, but there was something about the quiet streets that gave me the same uneasy feeling as before. We pulled over near the edge of town to stretch our legs. The streets were empty, lit only by a few old-style street lamps that buzzed faintly in the humid night air. The houses looked old, with porches and wooden railings and those thin lace curtains that move when the wind blows. There was no movement, no sound but the crickets. Even so, I could swear I felt eyes on us. Like the houses themselves were aware we were there. We didn't stay long. Something about that place made me want to keep moving. That night, when we finally got to our next stop, I lay awake in my motel bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about all of it. The empty town, the crowded one, Casadaga, and that strange in-between feeling that tied them all together. It wasn't about ghosts or anything like that. It was something else. Something about how certain places can feel wrong, like they exist slightly out of sync with everything else around them. I've driven through hundreds of towns since then, some small, some big, some that barely show up on a map. But I've never forgotten that stretch of road between El Paso and Austin. Every time I look out a van window and see the endless Texas desert, I can't help but wonder if that town is still there. If it still switches between silence and life depending on when you pass through. Part of me wants to go back someday just to see it again in the daylight, but another part of me knows I probably never will. Because whatever that place was, I don't think it was meant to be revisited. It's better left out there on that empty highway, where the desert swallows sound and time doesn't seem to move quite right. I had been in Japan for almost a year when my jet program contract finally ended. I'd spent that year teaching English in Kochi City, which sits on the southern coast of Shikoku. By Japanese standards, it was remote, not the sort of place people outside the prefecture ever visited. Kochi was quiet, simple, and in many ways stuck in time. It had its charms, but it wasn't Tokyo or Osaka. Most people I met would wrinkle their noses or look confused when I told them where I lived. They'd say, "Why there?" in polite disbelief. But for me, it was home. I'd grown to love the way the mountains pressed close to the city. The old women selling vegetables from tiny stands along the road. The sound of cicadas that filled every summer evening until it was almost deafening. When my contract ended, I still had 6 weeks left before I had to return home. I decided to use the time to travel around and see parts of Japan I hadn't gotten to visit yet. My best friend Kevin flew in from back home to join me. He'd been planning the trip for months, and when he arrived, we immediately began sketching out routes and places we wanted to see, mostly small towns and mountain roads. Another friend of mine, Jason, who was also teaching through JET, wanted to come along for part of it, and my Japanese friend Takanori, Take for short, agreed to come too. He was from Kansai, more sophisticated and fashionable than the rest of us, but he loved the idea of a road trip through the back roads of Shikoku. I had bought a little Daihatsu car during my time there, a tiny thing that barely had enough power to haul us up the steep mountain roads. It was old, secondhand, and cheap, but it had served me well. It was also the first car I had ever owned in another country, and despite its rattles and squeaks, I had a fondness for it. Our plan was simple. We'd drive from Kochi City to Matsuyama, which was on the northern side of the island. It was supposed to be about a 4-hour drive. Matsuyama was famous for Dogo Onsen, one of Japan's oldest hot springs, and we figured it would be a good way to wrap up my time there. Relaxing in the baths, wandering through the old castle district, maybe staying the night in a hostel before coming back the next day. We left late on a Saturday morning. The day was already warm, the kind of sticky summer heat that makes the air shimmer over the asphalt. The road wound steadily upward through dense green hills, the car whining every time we hit a steep incline. By the second hour, we were already pulling over every now and then to refill the radiator. I had been having issues with overheating for a while, but I didn't think it would be this bad. Each time we stopped, we'd let the hood cool, fill the radiator with bottles of water we'd bought from convenience stores, and wait in the shade by the road. Despite the delays, the drive was beautiful. Rice paddies stretched out on either side of the road, their flooded surfaces reflecting the mountains and sky. The air was full of the hum of insects, and every few minutes we'd pass a small farmhouse, the smell of wet earth and wood smoke drifting out. It was the kind of scenery that made Japan feel endless, green and wild and quiet. After about 3 hours, the car started to struggle again. The temperature gauge crept higher and higher, and eventually the engine gave up. We were climbing into another stretch of wooded mountains when it finally died. I steered onto the shoulder, which was mercifully wide, right in front of a dark, weathered building that looked like a mountain hut. The windows were covered in grime, the wood warped and gray. It didn't look lived in. We hadn't seen a proper town for at least half an hour, and the occasional car that passed didn't slow down. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by forests that seemed to go on forever. Take called JAF, Japan's version of A, and after a halting conversation, they said they could get someone out to us, but it would take a few hours. There wasn't much to do except wait. We sat in the thin shade beside the car, sweat soaking through our shirts. Every once in a while, a breeze came down from the mountains and rustled the trees, but otherwise, it was silent except for the buzzing of cicadas. We wandered around a bit, trying to see if there was anyone in the nearby house. The place looked completely abandoned, broken dishes and trash scattered inside, piles of old tatami mats, some torn clothes, and a few empty cans. It felt like whoever had lived there had left in a hurry or just let everything rot. I remember the smell most of all, that sour, moldy smell of wood that had been wet for too long. After 2 long hours, the tow truck finally arrived. The mechanic, a small man in a blue jumpsuit, popped the hood, peered in, and quickly diagnosed the problem. The radiator was cracked. It would cost about $1,000 to replace. That was almost exactly what I had paid for the car in the first place. I felt sick. I had been planning to sell the car after the trip and use the money for a trip to Hokkaido with Kevin before flying home. The mechanic filled the radiator again, said it should be fine for now, and suggested we drive carefully to Matsuyama to get it properly looked at there. He gave a little bow, packed up his tools, and drove off, leaving us once again alone on the mountain road. We climbed back in, resigned to whatever came next. The car started fine, and we continued along the narrow road that hugged the side of a ravine. The trees grew thicker on either side, filtering the sunlight into shifting bands that slid across the windshield. The air smelled like pine and hot dust. Then, up ahead on the right, we noticed a small clearing with what looked like a shack. Around it, for maybe 50 yards in both directions, were piles of junk. Old bicycles, rusted appliances, cracked pottery, faded plastic toys, and heaps of tangled metal. Across the road, directly opposite the shack, was a bus stop, a single wooden bench under a tiny tin roof. We slowed down, all of us staring at the scene. It looked more like a dump than a property. Just as we were about to drive past, Take shouted for me to stop and turn around. He said he had an idea. I swung the car around, tires crunching on the gravel shoulder, and pulled up beside the junk pile. We got out and walked toward the shack. As we approached, I noticed how quiet it was. No sound of cars, no movement except for a few flies buzzing lazily in the heat. Then from the shadow of the doorway, a figure emerged. And then another. And another 4 people in total stepped out, 3 men and 1 woman. They were filthy, their clothes stained and threadbare. The men looked sunburned and hollow-eyed, with bad teeth, some gold, some black, some missing entirely. The woman's hair was tangled, her skin leathery. On the porch was a cage holding a scrawny cat, and on top of that cage was another one holding a rooster and a pigeon together, both pecking at the same dish of food. A small blind dog with cloudy eyes lay panting in the dirt beside them. Something about the scene felt off immediately. These weren't just poor rural people. There was something strange in the way they stood, silent and staring, their eyes flicking from one of us to the next. Take started explaining our situation to them in Japanese. The men smiled, or at least pulled their mouths into shapes that might have been smiles. The woman laughed, a dry, high-pitched sound. The air around the shack smelled of rot and something chemical, maybe oil or old paint. They seemed eager to help in their own way. They brought out an old plastic jug and offered to sell it to us for about $20. We needed water for the car, so Take agreed. Then they said we could fill it for another $5. He handed over the money, and one of the men slowly shuffled off toward the back of the shack to fill it, while the rest stayed near us, watching. Inside, through the open doorway, I could see that the interior was full of junk too. Boxes, plastic bags, old tools, random appliances stacked haphazardly. Everything had handwritten price tags. It looked less like a home and more like a junk shop that had been abandoned decades ago and then reclaimed by its owners. When the man came back with the filled jug, they started talking again, and Take translated that they wanted to buy my car. They offered about $35. At first I thought I'd misheard him. $35 for the car? It was ridiculous. But at the same time, given the state it was in and the cost of fixing it, part of me actually considered it. I could just leave the car there, take the bus, and be done with it. We stepped away from the shack to talk it over. The longer we stood there, though, the stranger everything felt. There was something about that place. The smell, the oppressive stillness, the way the family kept watching us without saying anything. I started noticing details I hadn't before. Fish tanks full of cloudy water, each with some slow-moving fish inside. Huge rocks lined up beside the path with prices painted directly on them. A wall covered in old chainsaws, their metal teeth orange with rust. We wandered further around the property, half curious, half uneasy. There were sheds made of mismatched wood and corrugated metal, each one filled with more junk. One was lined with old karaoke machines stacked floor to ceiling, each with a faded tag. Another had shelves of old liquor bottles and dusty bento boxes. Everything had a price. Everything was for sale. The longer I looked, the more unnerved I became. It wasn't just the junk. It was how isolated the place was. It was how every item looked like it had been taken from somewhere else. Someone else's possessions, someone else's memories, now sitting here under the sun, decaying. We could feel their eyes on us the whole time. They never looked away. They just stood by the shack, watching us move around their property, their faces expressionless, as if they were waiting for something. I walked back to where the patriarch stood, still near the porch, and tried to ask a few questions through Take. I wanted to know what exactly they planned to do if I sold them the car. Would they handle the paperwork? How would we get to town afterward? He said there was a bus stop across the road, that same lonely bench, and that a bus came by sometimes. He wouldn't drive us anywhere. He said if I left the car, he'd take care of the deed later at City Hall and send me my share. None of it sounded right. The way he said it, the way his face barely moved, it all felt wrong. I had the sudden, clear realization that if we stayed there too long, something bad might happen. It wasn't anything specific, just a heavy, crawling sense that this was a place where people disappeared and no one ever asked questions. I told Take I didn't want to sell it. I didn't care about the money anymore. I just wanted to leave. We got back into the car and started the engine. It sputtered at first, then caught. As we pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw them still standing there, all four of them, unmoving, their faces blank, watching us go. The road curved away quickly, swallowed by trees, and the shack disappeared from sight. None of us spoke for several minutes. The only sound was the hum of the tires and the faint whine of the engine. When we finally reached the outskirts of Matsuyama, the sight of gas stations, buildings, and people walking on sidewalks felt surreal, like waking up after a nightmare. We found a small hostel near the center of town and checked in, exhausted. My shirt was soaked through, my skin sticky with sweat, and I couldn't stop thinking about that family and the piles of junk. The next morning, I took the car to a small Daihatsu garage I found a few blocks away. The mechanic there was friendly, middle-aged, and surprisingly spoke a little English. He looked at the radiator, nodded, and said it wasn't cracked at all, just the water pump. He replaced it for the equivalent of about $65. They even brought us free drinks while we waited and gave us snacks for the road. When I asked if he'd ever heard of people living out near that ravine road, he just frowned and said it was strange, that nobody lived out there permanently. Too dangerous, he said. The mountains were full of landslides, and there wasn't any farmland or reason to stay. I didn't say anything after that. I didn't want to think too hard about who those people were or why they were there. We made it back to Kochi a few days later. The car ran perfectly. I ended up selling it to another teacher for a fair price before I left Japan. Life went on, but sometimes even now when I think about that day, I can still see that shack on the mountain road. The piles of broken glass, the smell of rot and oil, the wall of chainsaws. The four of them standing there in silence, watching as we drove away. And I still wonder if anyone ever stopped there after us, or if the bus at that lonely stop across the road ever really came at all. I still think about that day sometimes, especially when I'm driving through empty stretches of highway. There's something about long roads and fading daylight that brings it all back. We were just trying to make it to the Canadian Rockies, nothing more than a regular road trip. We'd been planning it for months. The route was simple. Start in Wisconsin, take our time through the Dakotas and Wyoming, head into Montana, and then cut north toward Calgary before going west. We'd done long drives before, so this wasn't new to us. We were used to small towns, the kind that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1950s. Usually, they were quiet, friendly, maybe a little run down, but always harmless. That's why what happened in Montana felt so strange. It didn't just feel like a bad encounter. It felt wrong, like we'd accidentally wandered somewhere we shouldn't have. That morning had been normal. We'd packed up early from a campground in Wyoming, a few hours outside of Cody. The air was dry and cool, the kind that wakes you up better than coffee. We'd been camping for nearly 2 weeks at that point, rotating between KOA campgrounds and random public ones. It was the kind of trip where every morning looked different. Mountains one day, open plains the next. We weren't really on a schedule. The goal was just to keep moving. We spent most of that day driving west across Montana's wide, empty roads. If you've never been through that part of the country, it's hard to describe how empty it feels. It's beautiful, but there's a strange loneliness to it. You can drive for an hour and not see another car. The fields stretch forever and the sky looks too big. It gives you a feeling that's hard to explain, like the world is too open, too quiet. We started looking for a place to stop around late afternoon. It was getting close to 5, the sun starting to dip low enough that everything looked gold. We figured we'd find a small town, fill up the tank, grab something to eat, and stay the night at a nearby campground before heading north in the morning. That was the plan. I still remember the first sign we saw for the town. It was small and sun-faded, sitting crooked in the dirt on the side of the road. The population listed was around 200, maybe a little more, though the number's blurry in my memory now. There wasn't much around it except a few old wooden buildings, one gas station, a restaurant, and what looked like a small motel off to the side. It looked like dozens of other places we'd stopped at on the trip. Nothing unusual about it, at least at first glance. But even before we pulled in, something felt off. The main street was completely empty. Not just quiet, empty. No cars driving through, no one walking, no dogs, no sound. Usually in towns that small, there's at least a few people outside. Someone sitting on a porch or a kid on a bike. But this place looked dead. I remember thinking maybe everyone was just inside eating dinner or something. But even that didn't really make sense. It was too early for everything to be shut down. We pulled into the gas station first. It was one of those old-style stations with a small garage attached. the kind that looks like it's been around forever. The paint was peeling off the sign, and one of the lights above the pump was flickering. The air smelled like dust and old gasoline. When I stepped out of the car, it felt like the whole place had been frozen in time. The air was still heavy somehow, like everything was waiting. I looked around, expecting to see someone working the station, or at least sitting behind the counter inside. But the windows were dark, not pitch black, just enough that you couldn't see much in there except your own reflection. I started pumping gas while the others stretched their legs. The wind picked up just slightly, carrying that dry, grassy smell that seems to linger in Montana. I remember scanning the buildings around us, trying to get a feel for the town. A few of them looked abandoned, broken windows, boards across doors, but others seemed maintained, at least a little. There was a post office, a diner down the street, and a few houses scattered beyond that. I could see curtains in the windows, but no movement anywhere. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed something in the window of the gas station's garage area. The blinds were down, but tilted open enough that you could see through them a little. First, I thought maybe it was a reflection or something, but then I realized I was looking at someone or something inside. It was a kid, or at least it looked like one. He was standing in the corner, half hidden by the blinds. He had no hair at all, not shaved but bald, like completely smooth. His skin looked pale, almost grayish in the dim light. He was just standing there, staring toward us. The second he realized I saw him, he stepped back fast, disappearing into the dark. It wasn't like a curious kid ducking away. It was too quick, too deliberate. It made my stomach twist. I remember glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed, but no one had. I didn't say anything. I just went back to watching the gas meter tick up, pretending I hadn't seen it. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just someone's kid playing around inside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that moment wasn't right. When we finished filling up, we were supposed to go inside and grab drinks and snacks like usual, but nobody felt like it. We stood there for a second, looking toward the store entrance. The open sign was lit, but no one was behind the counter. The door was shut, and the windows were too dark to see through. One of us mumbled something like, "Let's just go," and we did. It felt like the air had gotten thicker somehow, heavier. Even the sounds of the wind seemed to fade. We got back into the car and decided to drive down the street to that diner we'd passed on the way in. The place was called Pat's Diner. The sign was faded and chipped, but the lights inside were on. From the outside, it looked a lot more inviting than the gas station. Yellow light spilling from the windows, the sound of people talking and laughing inside. There were a couple of cars parked in front, nothing out of the ordinary. After how strange the gas station had felt, we were almost relieved to see something that looked normal. We parked and started walking toward the entrance. As we got closer, I could hear the hum of voices more clearly. Lots of people talking over each other, the occasional burst of laughter, the sound of plates clinking. It sounded like a small-town dinner rush. I remember thinking it was almost too busy for a town that small, but I didn't care. After hours on the road, I just wanted to sit down and eat something warm. The second we opened the door, everything stopped. It was like someone hit pause on the entire room. Every sound died instantly. The laughter, the talking, the noise, it all just vanished. The only sound left was the squeak of the door slowly closing behind us. Every single person in that diner had turned to stare. There must have been 50 people crammed inside, sitting at maybe 15 tables, all packed tight. They were all looking right at us. No one blinked, no one moved. Just staring. For a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe. I kept waiting for someone to say something, for the moment to break. But it didn't. I remember my heart pounding so hard that it felt like I could hear it echoing in my head. And then I saw her. She was sitting in a booth directly across from the door. She looked ancient, with deep lines on her face and thin gray hair pulled back tight. But what I noticed most was that she was wearing 2 eye patches, one over each eye. I didn't even know what to think. I'd never seen anything like that before. She was sitting perfectly still, facing straight toward us. And then, without a word, she slowly turned her head to the side, like it took effort, and just kept staring even though she couldn't see. I can't explain why, but that moment froze me more than anything else. It wasn't what she said, it was what I felt. Something in that room was wrong. The air felt charged, like a weight pressing against my chest. No one spoke. No one moved. Just dozens of eyes on us. I don't even remember what happened next exactly, only that we turned around and left. Not walked, ran. We ran back to the car, the gravel crunching under our shoes, slamming the doors, locking them without even thinking. The whole time I didn't look back at the diner. I didn't want to. The second the car engine started, we tore out of that town as fast as we could, not saying a single word. It was only when we were miles down the highway that someone finally broke the silence and asked what the hell that had been. Nobody had an answer. We didn't stop again until we crossed into Canada, hours later, still trying to make sense of it. But here's the thing. The more time has passed, the less sure I am that I can explain it. I've tried to reason it out. Maybe it was some kind of local hangout where outsiders weren't welcome. Maybe we just walked into a small town with a tight-knit group of people who didn't like strangers. But even then, it doesn't make sense. The emptiness of the streets, the bald kid in the window, the way that diner was so full when the rest of the town seemed deserted, it doesn't fit together. And that old woman sitting there with 2 eye patches, asking us what we wanted in that voice that still echoes in my mind sometimes. None of it fits any normal explanation. After we crossed into Canada, we barely talked about it. It was like everyone silently agreed not to bring it up. We stayed near Glacier National Park for a few days, camped by a lake, tried to pretend everything was fine. But at night when things got quiet, I'd think back to that town. I'd replay it in my head, trying to spot some detail I'd missed, some clue that made it all make sense. But all I ever came back to was the same feeling I had when we first pulled in. That strange, heavy stillness, like the town itself didn't want us there. Sometimes when I look at a map, I try to figure out exactly where it was. I've even looked through lists of small towns west of Billings trying to find one with a similar layout. A diner, a single gas station, maybe a small motel. But nothing ever seems to match. It's like that place just disappeared. Maybe it did. Maybe it was just some dying town we stumbled into at the wrong time. But if that's true, I still can't explain why it felt like the whole place was waiting for us to leave. Why it felt like something was wrong before we even realized it. I've driven through Montana again since then, years later on a different trip. I thought about trying to find it, but I couldn't bring myself to. As soon as I saw another one of those small population signs on the side of the road, my stomach turned the same way it did that day. I just kept driving. There are a lot of empty towns in that part of the country, some abandoned, some still barely hanging on. I guess some places aren't meant to be found again. Even now, when I think about it too long, I get that same uneasy feeling in my gut. Not fear exactly, but something close. Like maybe for a few minutes we weren't just lost on the road. We were somewhere we shouldn't have been. Somewhere that wasn't meant for us. And the strangest part? Sometimes when I close my eyes and think back to that moment in the diner, I can still hear the sound of laughter, just before it stopped. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place that looked peaceful from the outside but carried an odd weight in the air. Something you only felt if you lived there long enough. Everyone knew everyone else, and most of us had families that had lived there for generations. The main road ran right through town, splitting it clean in half. On one side, the diner, post office, and a single gas station. On the other, our high school and the football field. Behind the school was the student parking lot, where rows of dusty trucks sat every morning, lined up like soldiers, the smell of oil, metal, and damp grass mixed with the sound of gravel crunching under tires. Every morning we parked in roughly the same spots, like unspoken assigned seats. Most of the trucks had gun racks behind the seats, some with old shotguns or rifles left visible through the rear windows. It wasn't strange. In our town, hunting was as common as breathing. Most of us hunted deer in the fall and small game in the winter. It was normal to see a rifle in someone's truck, and even the teachers didn't care much. The first week of school always started with the same back-to-school assembly in the gym. The smell of waxed floors and old sweat filled the air. The principal, Mr. Hendricks, was a tall, quiet man with a voice that carried. He always wore the same brown suit, shiny on the elbows and knees from years of use. He had this way of giving speeches that felt more like conversations. Even though he never cracked a smile, every year, he'd go over the usual things: dress code, attendance, sports tryouts, and then he'd pause before getting to the part everyone expected. He'd clear his throat and say that it was perfectly fine for us to have guns in our trucks if we were hunting before or after school. Then he'd always add that it would be best to keep them out of sight, under the seat or behind something, because sometimes the state troopers would drive by. He didn't want anyone getting in trouble. That speech never changed, not once. Even after Columbine, he still gave it. Maybe more carefully, but he gave it all the same. It was just part of the rhythm of the year. Nobody thought twice about it. It was small-town life. You grew up around guns, knew how to use them, and respected them. I never thought much of those assemblies, but one year stands out clearly. 2001, the year before Mr. Hendricks retired. I was a junior then. Life felt predictable, simple even. We hunted, worked on our trucks, and spent weekends by the lake. But that fall, something felt slightly off, though at first I couldn't say why. It started with a break-in at the local feed store. Someone smashed the back door open and stole a few boxes of ammo and a pair of hunting knives. The sheriff came to the school a few days later asking questions, but nobody knew anything. Or at least, nobody admitted to knowing anything. Things like that just didn't happen in our town. A week later, one of the seniors, a quiet kid named Mark, didn't show up for school. His truck was still parked in the same spot near the far end of the lot, the one closest to the trees that bordered the property. Nobody thought much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for a truck to stay there a night or two if someone got a ride with a friend. But then Friday came, and his truck was still there. By Monday, the smell had started. The lot was half gravel, half cracked pavement, and when it rained, water pooled around the low spots. The stench seemed to rise from one of those puddles near Mark's truck. By second period, the janitor and a few teachers were walking around trying to figure it out. At lunch, everyone knew. They found him in the cab, slumped forward, a shotgun beside him. They said it was suicide. Everyone said it quietly, like saying it too loud would make it real. That afternoon, school let out early. I remember walking past his truck as they towed it away, a stained blanket covering the driver's window. The sight of it stuck in my head for weeks. The next few months blurred together. Counselors came to talk to us, and there were talks about mental health and reaching out. But in small towns like ours, people don't talk about their problems. They just keep going. That winter was colder than usual. The wind cut across the open fields and made the highway shimmer like steel. Snow came early, covering everything in white. The school felt quieter after that, more careful somehow. Teachers watched us more closely. The principal seemed older, more tired. But the same speech came again at the start of spring semester. The same reminder about guns and trucks. Some people thought he shouldn't mention it anymore, that it felt wrong after what had happened. But others said it was tradition, that it was just part of who we were. The truth was, no one had stopped bringing guns. You couldn't expect farm kids and hunters to change overnight. It was just the way it was. I thought things might finally go back to normal after that, but that spring, something else happened. It was late April, and turkey season was about to start. A few of us had been talking about going out before school on the first morning of the season, so we kept our gear ready in the trucks. The parking lot was always full of muddy tire tracks by that time of year. It was warm enough to roll the windows down, and sometimes you could hear the highway hum in the distance. That morning, I got to school early, before most others. The sun was still low, the air cool and sharp. My truck's heater was weak, so I sat for a minute, letting the engine idle. The parking lot was quiet except for the sound of my engine and the faint rumble of an 18-wheeler on the highway. Then I saw it. A black pickup parked near the far corner, the same spot where Mark's truck used to sit. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The windows were tinted dark, and the bed was covered with a tarp tied down with bungee cords. At first, I didn't think much of it. We got random cars in the lot sometimes. Parents dropping something off, delivery drivers, things like that. But when the bell rang and I went inside, I noticed something strange. The truck was still there at lunch, still in the same spot, engine off, no one inside. By the time school ended, the truck hadn't moved. The next morning, it was there again. That was when people started talking. The sheriff came by and looked at it. A few teachers stood by the doors, whispering. Word spread that the plates were covered in mud and unreadable. Then one of the kids, a sophomore named Lucas, said he'd seen someone sitting in it early that morning, just before sunrise. He said the person didn't look like anyone from town. He described a man with a baseball cap pulled low and a heavy coat, just sitting still, staring at the school. By noon, the truck was gone. Nobody saw it leave. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lived just outside town, past a stretch of pine forest that met the edge of a long, narrow field. Our house sat back from the road, and sometimes you could see headlights from passing cars through the trees. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to that familiar glow moving along the walls of my room. I figured it was just someone driving by until I realized the lights didn't fade. They slowed. Then they stopped. The hum of an idling engine carried faintly through the window. I sat up and looked out. Through the thin curtains, I could see the outline of a truck on the road, parked just beyond our mailbox. The headlights dimmed for a moment, then turned off completely. It was too dark to make out the color, but something about the shape of it felt familiar. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the truck was gone, leaving only a faint patch of tire marks in the dew-covered grass by the ditch. At school that day, everyone was on edge. The principal called an unscheduled assembly, something he hadn't done since the year Mark died. The gym filled with the noise of shuffling feet and whispers. Mr. Hendricks stood on the stage, his face more lined than I'd ever seen. He talked about safety, about how times were changing, about being careful, but his voice was shaky. He didn't mention guns at all, not once. That was the last assembly he ever gave. He retired that summer, and the new principal banned guns on school grounds entirely. People in town weren't happy. Some said it was disrespectful to tradition, that it was giving in to fear. But for others, it was a relief. I graduated the next year, left town soon after. I didn't think much about it for a long time. Then, years later, while driving through the area on a visit, I stopped at the old school. It had been repainted, the parking lot resurfaced, but the shape of it was still the same. The spot where we used to park our trucks was now marked with visitor signs and security cameras. The world had moved on. As I stood there looking out over the lot, I noticed something strange. A truck, black, older model, maybe early 2000s, was parked at the far end by the trees. The same spot as always. The windows were tinted dark and the bed was covered with a tarp. It could have been coincidence. Maybe someone just parked there without knowing, but the sight of it froze me where I stood. The air was still, heavy, and the faint smell of oil drifted across the asphalt. I stood there for a long time, just staring, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, I got back in my car and left. But as I turned onto the highway, I glanced in the mirror. The truck's headlights flicked on. I don't know if it followed me or if it just happened to leave at the same time. I didn't slow down to check. I drove until the town was just a faint glow behind me, and only then did I realize my hands were shaking. In a place that small, the past never really stays buried. It just sits there, quiet, patient, waiting for someone to look back long enough for it to notice. It was supposed to be a simple day trip. We'd been talking about going to Centralia for months, mostly out of curiosity. The abandoned town, the underground fires, the cracked streets with steam rising from them. It had that strange mix of mystery and decay that pulled people in. We weren't ghost hunters or anything like that. just bored people looking for something different to do on a weekend. It was a gray, humid afternoon in late summer when we finally decided to go. We left a little later than planned, around noon. The sky had that dull, heavy look it gets before a thunderstorm, though the forecast didn't say anything about rain. The drive started normal enough. Small highways, stretches of farmland, the occasional rusted-out gas station or roadside diner. But the deeper we got into Pennsylvania, the thinner traffic became. The towns we passed looked emptier, more forgotten. Somewhere after Ashland, we missed a turn. It wasn't a big deal at first. GPS kept recalculating, telling us to take one back road after another. I remember the road narrowing, the pavement giving way to patched asphalt, then to loose gravel. The trees grew denser, pressing closer to both sides of the road until it felt like we were driving through a tunnel made of green. At first, we joked about it, about how every horror story starts like this. It's about how we'd probably end up in someone's backyard or stumble onto private property. The GPS signal flickered in and out. Sometimes it froze entirely. Eventually, the little blue arrow on the map just spun in place. That's when the joking stopped. We kept driving anyway, figuring the road had to go somewhere. It wound steadily upward, hugging the side of a wooded mountain. The gravel was uneven and pale gray, slick from a thin layer of dust. The higher we went, the more the air seemed to thicken. It wasn't just humidity. It was that heavy, stale feeling of being somewhere people didn't go often. Every few minutes, the car tires crunched over small branches or chunks of stone. There were no houses, no signs, no mailboxes. Just trees and a long, curling road disappearing into them. The light started to fade even though it wasn't evening yet, dimmed by the thick canopy above us. Then, without warning, the trees opened up. The road widened slightly and ended in a small clearing, maybe the size of a parking lot. There was no pavement, just packed dirt and gravel. In the center stood a low stone well. It looked old, but not abandoned. The stones were clean, stacked neatly, the mortar in good condition. Around the base were small flags, plastic flowers, and a metal sign. We got out of the car to look. The air was dead quiet except for the ticking of the cooling engine and the occasional hum of a distant insect. When I got close enough to read the sign, I realized it was a memorial, dedicated to local firemen who had died fighting the mine fire that had destroyed Centralia decades ago. Someone clearly maintained it. The flowers weren't faded yet. The flags were new. There was something both peaceful and eerie about it. The stone well was dry, just a black hole at its center. Beyond it, the forest pressed close again, dark and thick. For a few seconds, we stood there, trying to decide what to do next. Then my eyes drifted past the sign to something behind it. At first, I thought it was a shed, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw that it was a small wooden house half hidden among the trees. A tiny cottage with a steep roof, weathered boards, and a porch sagging slightly to one side. There were no lights on, no sound. The place looked like it had been built decades ago and never updated since, but that wasn't what made me uneasy. It was what surrounded it. The trees around the house weren't just trees anymore. They were filled with things, objects hanging, nailed, or tied to the trunks and branches. At first, it didn't make sense. My mind couldn't process what I was looking at. But as I focused, the shapes became clearer. Stuffed animals. Hundreds of them. Faded, torn, some missing limbs or eyes. Their fur had turned gray and patchy from years in the weather. Some were tied to branches by string or wire. Others hung upside down. Wind shifted through the trees and they swayed, turning slowly like bodies on a line. Mixed in with them were other things. Old plastic sunflowers, their bright yellow color now the color of dried hay. Lawn ornaments, frogs, flamingos, garden gnomes. Most of them cracked or melted from sun exposure. Some had been painted over with dark colors. There were dolls, too. A few nailed directly to trunks, their limbs spread out. Their faces were pale, their eyes either missing or painted black. And it wasn't just the trees. There were metal poles driven into the ground, each with something attached. Chairs dangling by their legs, rusted license plates, wooden shapes painted like pigs and roosters. One of the wooden pigs had been wrapped to a trunk with a strip of duct tape and what looked like an old orange extension cord. All of it formed a loose ring around the house, like a strange perimeter. The longer I looked, the more I realized there was a pattern to it. The spacing was almost even. Every tree had something. The poles were placed like markers. It wasn't random junk. Someone had arranged it, intentionally, carefully, maybe even ritualistically. I felt a deep unease settle in my stomach. The kind that doesn't come from fear exactly, but from something being wrong in a way you can't explain. It was too quiet, no birds, no rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, just the faint hiss of wind through dead plastic flowers and the soft creak of something turning on its string. The house didn't show any sign of life, but the grass around it was trimmed. The path to the porch was swept clear of leaves. The boards on the porch looked recently replaced. That was what made me realize someone still lived here. The thought hit me harder than I expected. Up to that point, I'd assumed it was just an abandoned place, one of those old properties people forget about. But the memorial out front was clean. The flowers were fresh. The yard was maintained. That meant someone came here often, or maybe never left. A faint smell drifted through the clearing, carried by the wind. It was hard to place at first, like burnt wood mixed with something sweet and rotten. My pulse started to quicken. I didn't say anything, but I could tell from the stiff way the others were standing that they felt it too. That same silent realization that we had wandered somewhere we shouldn't have been. There was something deeply personal about the place, like trespassing inside someone's mind. Whoever had hung all those things in the trees had done it for a reason, but I didn't want to know what it was. It didn't feel like art. It didn't feel like religion. It felt like obsession. A gust of wind came through the clearing then, stronger this time. The hanging toys knocked into each other with a soft thudding sound. One of the dolls spun around on its string, its head jerking forward and back. That was enough. We didn't even talk about it. We just turned and got back into the car. The gravel crunched loudly under our feet, breaking the silence for the first time since we arrived. When the engine started, it sounded deafeningly loud in the still air. I backed out slowly, not wanting to spray gravel toward the well or the memorial. My eyes kept flicking to the trees. Every shadow looked like movement. Every branch seemed too heavy. As we turned to head back down the road, I glanced into the side mirror. The cottage was still there, barely visible between the trunks, but for the briefest second, I thought I saw something dark move near the porch. Not a figure exactly, just a shift of shape, like someone stepping back into the shadows. I don't know if it was real or just my nerves, but I pressed harder on the gas. The drive back down the mountain felt longer than it should have. Every bend in the road looked the same. For a few minutes, I worried we'd somehow taken a wrong turn, that we'd end up back in that same clearing. The GPS still didn't work. The air inside the car was hot and stale, smelling faintly of dust and sweat. When we finally reached paved road again, it felt like coming up for air. We stopped at a gas station miles later, and no one said anything for a long time. We just sat there in the parking lot, drinking water and trying to shake off that feeling that we had been somewhere private, somewhere not meant to be found. I remember later looking up the area, trying to find out what that memorial was, if there were any records about it. I found references to a fireman's well near one of the old access roads leading toward Centralia, but nothing about a house, nothing about anyone living up there. I thought maybe it had been torn down, or maybe it was private property that wasn't on maps anymore. But the way it looked, the trimmed grass, the swept porch, still didn't make sense. Someone cared for that place. Someone kept it the way they wanted it, tucked away behind a wall of forest and gravel road. Even now, I think about that mountain sometimes, about how we didn't hear a single bird, not even once, about how the memorial looked freshly cared for, but the house behind it looked like it had been waiting for decades. About those stuffed animals slowly rotting as they turned in the wind. We got out of there fast and we never went back. But every time I see a forest thick with hanging vines or a yard full of strange decorations, that memory crawls back up. I remember that clearing, that quiet, that smell of burnt sweetness. Some places aren't haunted by ghosts. Some are just haunted by people, and by whatever they choose to leave behind. I was working on location somewhere outside Dublin, about an hour's drive or so. We'd been shooting all day, cold wind cutting through our coats and the light fading fast behind a layer of low clouds that looked like wet wool. The schedule was tight, and by the time we wrapped for the evening, most of us were too tired to care about anything other than getting food and sitting down. The production van smelled of wet jackets, stale coffee, and the faint metallic scent of camera gear. We were maybe 10 people in total, crew, a couple of actors, and the director, just trying to find a warm meal and a place to rest before heading back to the hotel. Someone looked up nearby towns on their phone, and the only one that came up was a small village off the main road. It barely looked like a town at all, just a scatter of houses and one main street on Google Maps. But there was a place marked as Bar and Grill, so that was enough for us. We decided to stop there for dinner before heading back to Dublin. It was already dark by the time we rolled into town. The rain had started again, not heavy but steady enough to make the roads shine like oil. The main street was narrow, lined with small, squat buildings that all looked old but kept up, at least from a distance. There were a few streetlights, their orange glow breaking through the mist, and most of the shop windows were dark. We slowed down looking for the bar. We almost missed it. It was on a corner, a stone building with a dark green front and a chalkboard sign propped up on the step. The sign said, "Bar Food, Hot Meals All Night," in crooked white letters. The chalk smeared from the rain. Inside, through the windows, we could see people. Lots of them. That was surprising. The whole street was empty, but the bar looked packed. It was lit by yellow bulbs that made everything inside look warm, golden. We were starving, and this looked perfect. We parked on the side of the road and got out, pulling our jackets tighter against the wind. The town was so quiet it almost felt abandoned. The only sound came from the bar, the faint hum of voices and the occasional clink of a glass. We crossed the street and went in. The door was heavy wood, and as soon as we stepped inside, everything changed. It was like someone hit mute on a remote control. 1 second there was laughter and noise, and the next silence. Complete silence. Every single person in that room, at least 40 or 50 men, all middle-aged or older, turned to look at us. Not in the curious, casual way people do when strangers walk in, but with a kind of fixed attention that felt wrong. Their faces didn't move. No smiles, no frowns, just blank stares. The air in there was thick, heavy with cigarette smoke and the smell of grease. It felt too warm after the cold outside. We stood just inside the door for a second, unsure what to do. The director was the first to speak, though his voice sounded too loud in the stillness. He said something about getting a table for dinner. I remember thinking how strange it was that no one was talking, not even whispering to each other, just staring. Behind the bar was a woman, the only one in the whole place. She was holding a plate of steaming food, something with meat and chips. And she froze just like everyone else when we came in. The plate was halfway between the counter and a man sitting near the end of the bar, but she didn't move to hand it to him. The director repeated himself, asking if they were serving food. The woman blinked once slowly, like she had to think about the question, and then she said flatly, "We don't sell food." That was it. Her tone wasn't rude or friendly. It was like she was reading the line off a card. No one else moved or spoke. The only sound was the faint buzz of a ceiling light and the ticking of what might have been an old clock behind the bar. It was one of those moments where you just feel something is wrong, even if you can't explain it. I glanced at the food she was holding, still steaming on the plate, and the smell of it reached us. Hot grease and fried potatoes. But she had said they didn't sell food. One of our camera assistants shifted his weight, his boots squeaking on the floor. That tiny sound seemed to echo in the room. I could feel eyes on us from every direction, like they were waiting for something. We didn't say anything else. The director gave a small, awkward nod, and we turned back toward the door. The floorboards creaked with every step, and as we walked out, I noticed a few of the men at the tables were still holding their pints mid-air. Not drinking, just frozen that way, staring. The cold air outside hit hard after the stuffy heat of the bar. I remember pulling in a breath that felt sharp in my chest. We walked quickly to the van, none of us saying a word. But just as we were about to get in, I heard the door open behind us. 3 men stepped out. They didn't say anything, didn't call out, just stood there on the step watching us. The bar's light spilled around them, outlining their shoulders and faces but leaving their eyes in shadow. I couldn't tell if they were angry or just curious, but there was something in the way they stood that made me uneasy. The driver started the van and we climbed in. The men stayed where they were, motionless, watching us. We pulled out slowly, tires crunching over the wet gravel, and as we turned down the narrow street, I glanced back through the rear window. They were still there, standing in the doorway, making sure we were leaving. Once we got out of town, nobody spoke for a long time. The road wound through open fields, dark except for our headlights catching the edges of stone walls and hedges. The rain had picked up again, streaking across the windshield, and the wipers thumped back and forth. The atmosphere in the van was heavy, like everyone was waiting for someone else to make sense of what just happened. Eventually, the director said we'd find somewhere else. There had to be another place open closer to the highway. But even when we stopped later at a 24-hour petrol station for sandwiches, none of us talked about it. That night, back at the hotel, I couldn't shake it. I lay in bed replaying the scene over and over. The moment we stepped in, the instant silence, the blank faces. It wasn't just that they didn't like outsiders. There was something deeper in that room. Something that felt older, like we'd walked into a space we weren't supposed to see. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. While the others were loading up gear, I looked up the bar online. It didn't exist, at least not under the name we'd seen on the chalkboard. There was no listing for a bar or restaurant in that town, just a closed-down grocery shop and a post office that had shut years ago. I double-checked on the map. The building was there, but listed as vacant. No phone number, no website, nothing. When I showed the director, he frowned and said maybe it had changed ownership and just hadn't been updated. We left it at that, though I could tell it bothered him too. A week later, we drove past that same stretch of road again, heading to a new location. I watched the roadside carefully, waiting for the turnoff to that little town. We slowed when the sign came up. The same distance, same route. But when we reached where the town should have been, there was nothing there. No main street. No buildings. Just a small crossroads surrounded by empty fields and hedges. Not even a sign of old foundations. We kept driving. No one said anything. But I looked out the window the whole way, watching the horizon fade into the gray mist. And even though I never saw that place again, I can still remember how it smelled. The stale smoke, the hot grease. The way the warmth inside the bar felt too close, too thick, like the air itself didn't want us there. Sometimes, when I drive through quiet rural towns, I catch that same smell from some roadside pub, and I get that same feeling in my gut, the one that tells me I should keep driving, and I always do.